Chapter 3, Your I Am I. We ask you now to proceed to the discovery of your master self by the process of self-analysis. In the most general sense, oneself is a composite of personal, mental, and physical qualities, parts, factors, and elements. When you say myself, employing the term in this sense, you mean your entire personal being, outer and inner, body and mind, and possibly spirit as well. You use the term self to distinguish your entire personal being from that of another person or those of the other persons. Here you perform a process of analysis or separation. This is really the first stage or step of your self-analysis by which you proceed to discover your master self or real self. The second stage or step of the self-analysis is that in which you abstract your ego, I am I or master self, from the physical self, the inner from the outer. You may do this by an act of consciousness in which reason cooperates with the imagination. You find that the innermost report of consciousness is that the I am I consciousness is not necessarily involved with your consciousness of your body, but that, on the contrary, the I am I may conceive itself as existent, even independent of the body which it inhabits. When self-consciousness says, I am I, it means thereby that it itself, the I am I consciousness, is not the body, but rather is a something or somewhat inhabiting and occupying the body, the latter being merely a physical garment which it occupies, or the instrument or machinery which it employs in physical activity. The I am I may raise the hand attached to the physical body by an act of will operating the physical muscles by means of currents of nerve force directed by the mind. The I am I may stand aside and contemplate the moving hand and the act by which the hand is moved, just as it may contemplate any physical object not attached to the body. Try this and you will see and feel this to be the case. You will find that you have the consciousness of your I am I deliberately moving your hand by an act of will, the hand being merely a portion of your physical machinery. Move your hand up and down, then sideways until the full conception and consciousness of your true relation to it is fully grasped by you. You will discover by similar experiments that you may likewise move any and every part of your physical body, even the whole body itself. Gradually, there will dawn upon you the recognition and realization that your body and each and every part or portion of it is but a fine piece of physical machinery, the movements of which you control by your will and your mind. You will then, perhaps for the first time, realize that your body is merely your physical machinery, any part of which, or the whole of which, the I am I may use, employ, control, direct, or set in motion, or render motionless, when it has learned the control of the nerves and muscles attached to and regulating the movement of the several parts of the body. It is true that the involuntary nervous system has taken over to a great degree certain movements of the physical body, particularly those movements and processes having to do with the internal organs. But science informs you that all of the involuntary muscles were originally voluntary organs or tissues, and that they have been gradually transformed to the involuntary and subconscious field of activities. The change being made in the interest of vital economy, i.e., that the self may have time in which to attend more closely to its voluntary physical activities. For that matter, most of your important voluntary muscular movements you have had to learn by practice and experience, as for instance, the movements of walking, using your knife and fork, writing, dressing yourself, etc. Furthermore, it is known that the Hatha yogis of India and others who have experimented along these lines have regained the control of the involuntary muscles and may start and stop their action or reverse the same at will. This being true not only of the muscles of the organs of digestion, assimilation, and elimination, but even of the heart itself. Your reason recognizes the fact that the particles of your body are constantly changing, your body today being entirely different from that which you occupied a few years ago, and quite different from that which you occupied when you were a child. But at the same time, your consciousness informs you that your I am I or ego or master self is identical with that of a few years ago, or even that of your childhood. You are the same I am I that you have always been, so far as your memory can report. So you see that not only is your body something that is used, controlled, and moved at will by your I am I or master self through its established mental and physical machinery, but also that your body is not at all the same body which you owned and used a few years back. In short, you see that while your body is constantly being changed, repaired, made over by the elimination of old, worn out material and the substitution of new, fresh material, your I am I remains unchanged in essential identity during your whole physical existence. The body is an impermanent and changing machine, while your I, which operates it, is the permanent and constant element of your being, the same operator engaged in running a constantly changing machine. Moreover, by using your imagination, you will discover that while it is possible for you to fancy yourself as occupying bodies of a different kind, almost any kind, in fact, one after another, yet it is absolutely impossible for you even to imagine yourself as being a different I am I under such conditions. The imagination will report that while it is able to picture you as taking on and laying aside different bodies, just as you now change suits of clothing or costumes, yet it is unable to picture you as laying aside your identical I am I and becoming another. Even when exerted to its wildest flights, the imagination will be compelled to report that the I am I remains the same, no matter how different the various bodies successively occupied by it may be. The imagination is even able to picture you as standing by your sleeping or dead body, viewing it as it would the body of another. In fact, many persons have had this experience in their dreams, but even in that case, the I am I is seen and felt to be the same old I, and as not having lost its sense of identity, continuity, or completeness. You can never imagine yourself as standing aside and viewing your I am I or master self in this way. For when you try it, you will find either that one, there is nothing to look at the I am I, or else two, that the I am I has nothing at which to look. You may profitably try the above experiments with the imagination. They will serve to fasten upon your consciousness certain essential limitations of the imagination which it cannot transcend, and certain essential attributes of the I am I of which it cannot be divested, even by will and imagination. You will thereby gain a vivid experience of certain fundamental facts of your mental being, which have heretofore been unknown to you. The lesson taught in this second stage of self-analysis is this: that the physical body in its parts and in its totality is not your I am I or master self, but is merely something belonging to and used by you in your task of expression and physical manifestation. Whatever else your I am I or master self may be or may not be, it certainly is not your physical body in its parts or its totality. If you wish corroborative proof, you have but to inquire of persons who have lost their arms or legs or other important parts of their body. They will invariably inform you that their I consciousness, their consciousness of self, is not in the least affected or diminished by the loss of portions of their body. They will tell you that the same old I is present, feeling as complete as ever and not being conscious of any loss of real selfhood. More than this, authoritative medical annals inform you that in cases of paralysis extending over the greater portion of the body, the I am I consciousness is still intact and undiminished. The report always is, I am still here, I am I, just as much as I ever was. We ask that you master this first step of self-analysis, at least to the extent that you actually feel in consciousness that there is a something or somewhat which owns, occupies, and uses your physical body as an instrument of expression, a machine for producing physical activity, but which in itself is superior to and master of that instrument or machine. and that something or somewhat is you, yourself. Do not rest content with merely acquiescing in the statement by reason of your seeing it intellectually. Seek to feel it as a fact of actual consciousness, for thereby you gain an important step in the unfoldment of personal power. Do not hesitate to call to your aid your imagination as well as your intellect, for both of these are valid instruments of your mental mechanism, each performing its own offices for you. Do not say, I can imagine anything, for really you cannot. The above experiments will show you that the imagination, as well as the intellect, has its limits and boundaries, beyond which it may not proceed. Do not pass this by as mere fancy or as unimportant. It is quite important and has distinct, particular part to play in the instruction which we are offering you in this book. We are seeking to have you see and feel that you are something or somewhat far more fundamental, essential, and real than you have ever imagined yourself to be. You may possibly think that now, having shown you that this I am I or master self is not the physical body, we're about to tell you that therefore it must be the mind. If so, you now look forward to the usual talk upon the subject of all is mind, of which you have heard so much, possibly too much. But you are mistaken if you suppose this. You will be required to disentangle yourself from your mind stuff as you have from your body stuff, before you are conscious of the full, clear, brilliant light of the I am I or master self. You are like the fly which is endeavoring to disentangle itself from the sticky fly paper in which it was caught. You have now released yourself from the body of the paper, but your legs and wings are still full of the sticky stuff, and you must now proceed like that fly, slowly and carefully, to free yourself of the foreign materials which keep you from using your wings and legs in perfect freedom and under perfect control. The third stage of your self-analysis is that in which you abstract your I am I or master self from that part of your mental nature which you call your emotional nature, i.e., your various feelings, emotions, agreeable or disagreeable mental states, and your desires. Remember, however, that you are not to be asked actually to discard this important part of your nature any more than you are expected actually to discard your very useful physical body. On the contrary, you will be expected to employ still more efficiently both physical body and emotional nature once that you have discovered that they are but your instruments and machinery, physical and mental, rather than being essential and inseparable elements of the I am I or master self. You are being asked to learn how to use as a master these instruments and that machinery instead of being used by them as their slave. But to be the master, you must first discover that you are superior to and essentially independent of these useful instruments and pieces of machinery. When you have learned this, then you may use these things as they should be used, by you as the master, not as the slave. First, learn to know, then proceed to use. You proceed to the attainment of the third stage of your self-analysis by 3 steps. 1, the discovery that your emotional states are temporary, impermanent, and changing. 2, the discovery that your emotional states may be observed, considered, examined, analyzed, and controlled by the I am I or master self, and that in such processes, they are able to be set aside as objects to which the attention of the I am I or master self is being directed, the latter always remaining as the subject, which is the conducting the examination. And 3, that after you have mentally abstracted or set aside all your emotional states, there's still a something or somewhat left unchanged, unimpaired, constant, and permanent, which cannot be set aside as an object of the attention, the I am I or master self. The first of the 3 above stages is quite easy of accomplishment. You have already discovered that your emotional states are impermanent and changeable. You remember that only a few years ago, perhaps only a few months, weeks, or days ago, you entertained an assortment of feelings, emotions, likes and dislikes, wishes, wants, and desires, vastly different from those entertained by you today. Your loves and hates have changed many times, often exchanging places, perhaps, at least changing in degree of intensity and in direction of object. In some cases, they have faded away so completely that it now requires a distinct effort of memory to recall them as having been previously experienced by you. Some persons are more constant in their feelings than are others, but some degrees of change are experienced by all persons. The feelings of the child change as the period of adolescence is approached. The emotions of the adolescent are different from those of the child and from those of the matured man or woman. The emotions of middle age are different still, and those of old age have their own particular character. Moreover, the constant play of circumstances and environment works changes in the emotional states of the individual. You have had personal experience of some of these changes, and observation and inquiry will satisfy you as to the rest. But your own experiences and your inquiries concerning those of others will disclose to you that in all such cases, the I am I, or the individual, his master self, remains constant, unchanged, and identical through all these innumerable changes and transmutations of the emotional states. The I am I, or master self, has survived these emotional storms, tempests, calms, and dead winds. In fact, its memory has forgotten many of them. The individual frequently wonders, was it possible that I ever felt in this way about these things or these persons? The I am I, or master self, is the constant, permanent something or somewhat which survives the temporary and ever-changing winds and storms of the emotional states. The second step, likewise, is easy when you have once grasped the idea. It consists merely of the examination, consideration, observation, and analysis of your emotional states. You find it quite easy to turn the light of attention upon any particular emotional state previously experienced, your attention being directed earnestly to it. You easily perceive its past history, how it originated, what it called into expression, how it rose to its height or climax, how it faded away or at least grew weaker, what ideas served to strengthen or weaken it, to feed or to starve it, how it became transmuted into another form of feeling, and so forth and so on. In short, you will find that you are able to examine, consider, observe, and mentally analyze any emotional state experienced by you, just as you would a tiny creature under the microscope. You place the emotional state as the object to be viewed under the microscope of the attention, the I am I, or master self, always being the subject conducting the examination at the observation end of the microscope. Moreover, you remember many instances in which you have controlled, held back, or urged forward, guided and directed, and generally managed some of your emotional states. This, in the degree of the awakening of your I am I, and by its employment of the will, you have learned at least to some extent how to restrain or inhibit many of your emotional states, your feelings and impulses, your desires and your tendencies. This in response to the dictates of prudence, ethics, morality, justice, self-respect, or self-interest, as the case may be. In short, you have demonstrated, at least to some degree, that the I am I, or master self, is the driver of the emotional steeds, the latter being the creatures guided and directed by the reins, bit and curb at will. And in doing this, you have demonstrated that the I am I, or master self, is one thing and the emotional states quite another thing, that the two are not identical at all. In the third step of this stage of your self-analysis, you proceed to the discovery of the fact that after you have mentally abstracted and set aside all of your emotional states, there is a something or somewhat left unchanged and unimpaired, fixed, constant, and permanent, the I am I, or master self, abiding at the very center of the kernel of your being. You may do this by the exercise of your memory and of your imagination, aided by the employment of your power of pure self-consciousness. You will see that just as in the past, your emotional states have changed or been transmuted, leaving the I am I, or master self, present in contrast, unchanged and unaltered fullness of being, So you may now, at the present time, mentally picture your I am I, or master self, experiencing several entirely different sets or assortments of emotional states, feelings, desires, etc., and yet ever remaining the same I am I, or master self, in spite of the changes. You may imagine yourself as playing many different parts and characters in the drama of life, yet always remaining the same identical I am I, or master self, abiding behind the mask and under the distinguishing emotional garments fitted to the role being played. Moreover, you may mentally picture yourself as having no emotional feelings at all at any given time, providing that the objects and ideas originally called forth by your emotional states have been wiped out of conscious and subconscious existence in your memory. But even in such extreme cases, you will be fully convinced that your I am I, or master self, would remain the same, constant, identical something or somewhat that it is now and always has been. The lesson taught in this third stage of self-analysis is this: that the emotional nature in all its stages, forms, aspects, modes, and manifestations is not the I am I, or master self, but instead merely something belonging to that essential and permanent entity. Whatever else your I am I, or master self may be or may not be, it certainly is not your emotional nature in its parts or in its totality. The fourth stage of self-analysis is that in which you abstract the I am I, or master self, from your thinking states. Your thinking states are composed of thoughts of various degrees of complexity, ranging from the simplest perception arising from sensation or sense report of any kind, to the higher combinations of thought which we call concepts, ideas, beliefs, judgments, conclusions. By carefully examining your thinking states, you will discover there is a condition which closely resembles that associated with your feeling states. That is to say, you will find your thinking states to be, one, impermanent and changing, and two, capable of examination, observation, experiment, analysis, control, and direction, thus being capable of being set aside as objects of the attention directed by the I am I, or master self, the latter being the subject exercising the power of attention. And number three, that after you have mentally set aside and examined all of these thinking states or thoughts, there is something or somewhat left constant, unchanged, unimpaired, and permanent, the I am I, or master self, which remains identical throughout all the processes of thought and thinking, transcending them all. Just as you found the feeling states, so now you find the thinking states to be subject to the law of change, modification, alteration, transformation, and transmutation. You have but to look backward over your past life, even but a few years back for that matter, to discover that there has been a constant evolution and development in your thoughts, judgments, beliefs, and conclusions. You know that new concepts, new ideas, new judgments, new conclusions have replaced those formerly held by yourself. Your experience has wrought many remarkable changes in this respect, many of your former beliefs, ideas, and convictions having been perhaps entirely reversed. You know that impaired health, old age, overwork, fatigue, or other physical causes have operated to alter, modify, and determine your ideas, opinions, beliefs, and convictions, and to alter and affect your powers of memory, reasoning, and constructive imagination. Again, your experience has taught you that environment and changed conditions have tended to modify greatly your thoughts, ideals, and beliefs, as well as your feelings. In short, you perceive that your thinking states are changeable, shifting, impermanent things, and not fixed, constant, unchangeable, and identical in nature. But equally, are you convinced that back of and at the center of these shifting currents of thought and thinking, there dwells and has always dwelt a something or somewhat, an I am I, or master self, which has remained constant, unchanged, unaffected, and essentially identical. You are always you and have always remained you and not but you, notwithstanding all of these changes of your thinking states or streams of thought, The thinker has always been there, always the same, no matter how the thoughts may have come and gone, changed and altered as the years have passed by. Likewise, you know that the I am I or master self is always the subject of the stream of thought which flows before it. Moreover, you know that by turning the attention upon any one set of ideas, it may detain them in consciousness or thrust them out of consciousness at will, if the will has been trained to work. Likewise, you know that it may call upon the memory or the imagination to do their respective work. The I am I or master self may create thoughts at will, combining the simpler elements into the more complex, comparing them and passing judgment upon them. This constitutes the processes of reasoning. There is a clear distinction between that which knows and that which is known, between that which thinks and that which is thought. One is the subject, thinker, the other the object, thought. The I am I is the substance or subject of consciousness and is not identical with any known phase, aspect, or mode of thought. Finally, you will discover that having mentally abstracted and set aside all of the thinking states in your process of self-analysis, there is still something left, constant, unchanged, unimpaired, permanent, and identical, the I am I or master self. This step or stage of total abstraction from the thinking states is accomplished only by the use of the imagination in the case of the ordinary individual. There are found, it is true, certain individuals, some of the Oriental ascetics and mystics, for instance, who have deliberately trained their minds so as to obtain a state of absolute quietude and freedom from the influence of the stream of thought. But such training is not advised for the ordinary individual, it having no practical advantage, but belonging rather to the category of abnormal psychology. There is no advantage to be gained by reaching the stage in which you think of nothing, although it is worthy of note that such mental states may be produced by those who are willing to undergo certain rigid and strenuous training of the power of attention. By the use of the imagination, however, you may easily picture yourself as immune to the impressions from the outside world, as in the case of one whose sense organs are inactive, and as having shut off or inhibited the reports of memory. Were your sense impressions temporarily inhibited, then you would have no new raw material of thought. And if also your memory were likewise temporarily inhibited, then your mind would be an absolute blank without any report of consciousness other than that of self-consciousness. But even so, there would still be the report of self-consciousness, the report of your own existence here and now. Of that, you could not divest yourself while you were conscious at all. What then would be this report of self-consciousness which would refuse to be inhibited and which would persist in spite of the inhibition of the sense reports and the memory reports? The answer is suggested by the definition of the term self-consciousness. That is, the consciousness of oneself as existent and in being. With impression from the outside world and also the reports of memory temporarily inhibited or shut off, your consciousness would be driven back upon that fundamental, essential, and ultimate report, I am I. It is worthy of note here that those who have cultivated the methods of total abstraction from the thinking states, the Oriental ascetics, for instance, report that even in the state of the utmost possible abstraction and detachment, they still find the report of existence and being, the consciousness of I am I, persisting, even though the consciousness of the details of the personality have been abstracted with the rest of the not I states of consciousness. It would seem that, try as he may, man is never able to escape the I am I consciousness while he is conscious at all. It is something from which he cannot abstract himself and something which he cannot set aside from his consciousness. But as we have said, you are not advised to experiment with the production of abnormal psychological states in order to prove to yourself that it is possible to absolutely inhibit the thinking states and thus to discover the I am I consciousness shining brightly in a mental world otherwise devoid of the light of consciousness. In fact, You are advised against indulging in any such extreme experiments. All that we wish you to do is to employ your imagination to the fullest and thereby discover that it is possible for you mentally to picture yourself in such a condition, to realize that such a mental state is possible. This is sufficient for the purpose before you in this instruction. We wish you to realize fully that there exists at the center of your being, at the center of your thinking states, as well as your feeling states, a something or somewhat which inevitably, invariably, and infallibly reports, I am I, so long as there is even the faintest glow of consciousness manifested. This something or somewhat which reports, I am I, is that master self, which is your real you, in yourself, of yourself, and by yourself. This I am I, or master self, is the permanent subject of your thinking processes and activities, and yet is superior to them and capable of rising above them. The thinking states rise and fall, appear and disappear, to be succeeded by others, manifesting the same process of appearance, expression, and disappearance. But the I am I, or master self, remains constant, permanent, and abiding throughout all of these processes of thought. The stream of thought may flow past, ever changing, ever passing, ever becoming, never the same for even 2 consecutive moments. But the thinker on the banks of the stream remains ever the same identical I am I, or master self, not a procession of I's, nor a series of changing I's, but ever the same identical I, constant, unchanged, unimpaired. The lesson taught in this 4th stage of self-analysis is this: that the thinking states in all of their stages, forms, aspects, modes, or manifestations of their activities and processes are not you, the I am I, or master self, but are merely something belonging to and used by you. Whatever else your master self may be or may not be, it certainly is not your thinking states in their parts or in their totality. The 5th stage of your self-analysis is that in which you abstract your I am I, or master self, from that part of your mental being which is indicated by the term will, i.e., the power by means of which you will perform actions, mental or physical. Will is always concerned with action, mental or physical. The will process is complete only when it manifests in action along mental or physical lines. Will is called into manifestation by desire, which in turn arises from feeling or emotion. It always goes out in the direction of an idea which has aroused the feeling, emotion, or desire. Desire is the connecting link between feeling and will. That which we call the will is far nearer to the I am I, or master self, than are the feeling states or the thinking states. It lies closer than either to you. It has an intimate character, so intimate that it is almost impossible to divest yourself of it, even in imagination. It is the body of the kernel of self, the germ of which is your I am I, or master self. Bigelow says, sensations originate outside of and inside of the body. Emotions originate inside of the body, but the will is deeper than either, and they are both objective to it. We cannot classify it with anything else. We cannot modify it by anything else. It itself modifies everything within its scope. Will is the assertion of a form of consciousness from the center outward. When it is opposed by another form of consciousness from the circumference inward, we recognize a hindrance to the free action of the will. Barrett says, we know little about the will. We know that we have wills and that we will. We are conscious that willing is not thinking or imagining. Most of us know little more. Some philosophers and metaphysicians have held that will is so intimately and closely bound up with the I am I, or master self, that it is impossible to disentangle them. But practical psychology has discovered that even will, like feeling and thinking, is capable of being abstracted and set apart from the I am I, or master self. They are to be examined, analyzed, and subjected to experiments. Thus, it is discovered, 1, that will is impermanent and changing in its manifestations and processes. 2, that its processes may be set apart as objects to be examined, observed, analyzed, and subjected to experiment by the subject I am I or master self. And 3, that you can conceive the I am I or master self as existing unchanged, unimpaired, and undisturbed in its totality, identical and constant, even when the will states have been abstracted from it. These processes may be performed with the will states as truly as with the feeling states. You know from experience that there are different degrees of will manifested by you at different times, that your will states vary at different times, that they change, are modified, or affected by changing feelings and emotions and changing ideas. You know from experience that by deliberately increasing the force of your emotional feeling, you can fan the fire of emotion so as to increase the supply and power of the stream of will. You know from experience that by deliberately directing and holding the attention upon certain ideas or objects, you can cause the will to move towards such ideas or objects. You know from experience that you may deliberately and systematically develop, train, and cultivate willpower so as to increase enormously its effectiveness. In short, you know by actual experience that there is a willer behind and back of the will, and that the will is but an instrument and machine operated by this willer. The willer, this director and master of will, can be nothing else but the I am I or master self. There is nothing else to be the willer, and nothing else which can control and direct the will, that great mover of the other mental states and conditions. The lesson taught in this 5th stage of self-analysis is this, that the will in all of its stages, forms, aspects, modes, or manifestations of its activities and processes is not you, yourself, but is merely something belonging to and used by you. Whatever else your master self may be or may not be, it certainly is not your will in its parts or in its totality. See you next week for chapter 4.